The Western Electric Model 500 telephone was an American institution for the better part of half a century. The original rotary dial version was introduced in 1950 and was then joined by a touch-tone version in the 1960s, although rotary telephones remained in common use well into the 1980s.
Remember when phones looked like this?
Even if you're too young to have grown up using one of these telephones, you've surely seen it in countless movies and TV shows, and you may even have the iconic sound of its dual gong bell ringer as your smartphone's ringtone. These telephones were incredibly sturdy and well known for their ruggedness, including being able to withstand falling off a table with no harm done.
This killer lamb has been trained to attack at the sound of a bell. Hello?
American consumers originally could not purchase their own telephone. You had to lease one from the telephone company. But with the breakup of the AT&T monopoly in the 1980s, other types of telephones did eventually become available for purchase, including cordless telephones.
You know how you always complain about how I twist the phone cord into little knots while I talk?
Drives me crazy.
Well, this AT&T phone has great sound and it's cordless, so you'll have nothing to complain about.
Nonetheless, many 500 series telephones remain in service, and you may wonder, is it possible to still buy one of these new today? And this is where I pulled a little bit of trickery on you, because this is not an original AT&T telephone from the 70s or 80s. This is actually a new model that you can still buy new today for about $45. If you pick up the handset, it says Cortelco, who was one of the original manufacturers that Western Electric licensed to build 500 series telephones. But aside from the name and its outward appearance, it's a shadow of its former self, especially in terms of weight. Whereas the original rotary dial Western Electric 500 telephone tips the scales at about 3 pounds, this new Cortelco version is over a pound lighter. Now, some of that is due to the lack of the heavy mechanical rotary dial mechanism, but even the later touch-tone versions made by Western Electric were not this light. Nonetheless, despite that weight loss, it actually does still have a real mechanical bell ringer, although it's not nearly as loud or as impressive sounding as the original. It's the Cortelco Model 250044. This one was made in 2019, but you can still buy the same model new today, and like you probably already guessed, it's now made in China. This rotary dial 500 telephone is also probably newer than you think, because according to the date on the bottom, this one was made in 1983. It was made for Western Electric by ITT, which is another company they licensed to manufacture these telephones. Here I have the book Principles of Electricity Applied to Telephone and Telegraph Work, a training course prepared for employees of AT&T in January 1953. Here it shows the 500 type telephone set, and aside from it being a darker color and the handset cord being a bit thicker, it's basically identical to the one I have from 1983, 30 years later. And aside from that dual gong mechanical bell ringer, one of the most defining characteristics of these telephones was the carbon microphone element. Inside the microphone are two metal plates separated by carbon granules, and when you apply a DC voltage to it, your voice generates a varying resistance which modulates the audio signal onto the phone line. Carbon microphones were a simple, reliable, and efficient way of generating a high-level audio signal without requiring additional amplification, which made them ideal for use in telephones. But they were not known for high fidelity. Carbon microphone elements have a limited bandwidth, high noise floor, and produce a characteristic grainy sound to the caller's voice. Now when we compare it to the new version available today, obviously the major changes are the touch-tone keypad instead of the rotary dial and the removable modular connectors on the cords. But both of those features were already common by the 1970s. But on the rear, there is one new feature that was not common during the 500's heyday, and that is this data port. That's for connecting a modem. That would have been very useful when these telephones were very commonly used in hotel rooms, but in-room Wi-Fi or Ethernet was not yet available. Many laptop computers up until the mid-2000s did have a built-in modem, but they did not provide a pass-through for your telephone. So this way, you could use this extra jack to connect your laptop modem while still being able to use the telephone. And I'm glad to see this one still has removable caps on the mouthpiece and earpiece of the receiver, because a lot of the later 500 series knockoffs had a completely molded handset, so these were not removable. Like this AT&T Model 100 telephone from 1991. This is the wall mount version. Its squared off handset never looked right to me, just like rectangular headlights on a Jeep Wrangler. And it also commits the cardinal sin of having an electronic ringer. And if I do remove that cap from the mouthpiece, you can see the other big change is that instead of that carbon microphone element, it now uses an electret condenser microphone, the same type that your smartphone uses today. And as much as I like that nostalgic sound of a carbon microphone, these are definitely much higher quality. Here is a direct comparison between the carbon microphone in the Western Electric rotary dial 500 telephone and the condenser microphone element in the new Cortelco telephone. It's still not high fidelity due to the limited bandwidth of the telephone system, but it's a much cleaner and less distorted sound. But unfortunately, one thing that is not higher quality is the way you can tell this thing is almost completely hollow inside. Just picking up the handset, you can hear that hook switch reverberate and rattle inside the entire case. Now compare that to the classic one. There is no reverberation or rattle on the hook switch. It sounds and feels much higher quality. If I flip this over to show you the bottom side again, you can see the mechanical volume control adjustment for the bell ringer. If I rotate this knob to the loud position, as indicated by the arrow, the hammer strikes both the low tone bell and high tone bell equally. But if I rotate it in the opposite direction, it reduces the volume of the ringer by mainly striking just the low tone bell, although this phone has the weird quirk where it starts out with the low tone bell, and then the high tone bell joins in about halfway through the ring. Looking at the bottom of the two phones, at a quick glance you might think that aside from the lack of this beautiful zinc chromate coating on the new one, they were both made from the same metal stamping. But upon closer examination, enough subtle differences are revealed to indicate that is definitely not the case. The one functional difference on the bottom is that although the new one still has the slot for the ringer volume adjustment, and the arrow indicating which position will make it louder, instead of a knob you can rotate to give you a variable adjustment of the ringer volume, it now has a two-position switch. As we heard earlier, in the loud position the ringer strikes both the low tone and high tone bells, while if you switch it to the quieter position it favors mostly the high tone bell, although you can still hear the low tone bell as well. Just like the old version, there is no way to disable the ringer entirely. Now, what about the sound quality of the receivers? Because if you look at the plastic molding, it looks pretty much identical between the two phones. But if you take off the cap, they definitely are not identical inside. The old one has this big chunk of metal, and you can see some terminals here. Again, a 1983 date code on it. And there you can see the diaphragm of the earpiece. And you compare that to the new one, just like the microphone inside it, it's mostly this plastic housing. And unfortunately you can't really see inside it, but I'm sure the actual part of this that makes the sound is a lot smaller than this plastic housing. But another factor in the sound quality of this new telephone is that unlike the old one, you get a volume control adjustment. The low setting is about the same as the standard non-adjustable volume of the old telephone, but then you can turn it up to the middle position, which makes it a little bit louder, and the high position, which makes it a lot louder, which is definitely helpful for people who are hard of hearing. But to make it fair, for the following sound quality comparison between these two telephones, I'll leave the new one set to the low position so they will be comparable in loudness.
Thank you for calling AT&T. Calls recorded for quality. Thank you for calling AT&T. Calls recorded for quality.
Thank you for calling Intel. Thank you for calling Intel.
Thank you for calling the corporate offices of the Original on Hold, Original Video Productions, and Original TV Commercials. Thank you for calling the corporate offices of the Original on Hold, Original Video Productions, and Original TV Commercials.
Removing the cover of the new one, you can see how the cabinet is now mostly empty space inside, aside from the dial and the bells and this big hook switch mechanism. Hiding underneath the keypad is the most modern looking part of the entire telephone, the main circuit board containing several surface mount ICs. The part number on this chip is so small I can't read it, but it was made by a company called BitTel, and next to that you can see the 2019 date code on the circuit board. And over here is a Fudan FM1062 chip, which performs all of the telephone's speech and line interface functions. And otherwise on the circuit board, it's mostly just a bunch of diodes and capacitors, and what looks like a voltage regulator. Another circuit board with the actual hook switch on it, and has a date of January 23rd, 2013. The bells were made by Hong Fu Sound. The larger one is the low tone bell, and the smaller one is the high tone. And all that annoying reverberation of the hook switch is caused by this spring, because if I hold it, it doesn't make that noise. So I'm going to try greasing this spring to try to reduce that noise from the hook switch. That fixed it. A little bit of synthetic grease on that spring, and it no longer rattles. That's what they should have done at the factory. Much better. Although this new Cortelco telephone cannot match the legendary durability and build quality of the original Western Electric 500 telephone, it certainly looks the part. In fact, when I was buying this at the thrift store and bringing it up to the checkout, 2 people in the store approached me and said, "Wow, I haven't seen one of those in years," because they really did think this was an original telephone from the 70s or 80s. And you have to admit that its sound quality is actually superior to the original. Plus, the bell ringer on these original ones was well known for being obnoxiously loud, so you may actually prefer the softer sound of the bell ringer in the new version. So if you want a traditionally styled, good-sounding, distraction-free landline telephone, it's good to know that these telephones are still being manufactured and sold today.
Yeah, remember what she said? I remember what she said. Do you remember what he said when she said that? Yeah, I remember that.